Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this IORMA event on green energy. My name is Richard Jackson. I'm the Director of Sustainability for University College London, and I'm delighted to be your moderator this afternoon, and hopefully I can do some justice to this very important topic. I'm going to be joined by three panelists who are introduced shortly. Obviously, this event has been put together by IORMA, and IORMA is, or at least the IORMA Consumer Commerce Centre, is a neutral resource for business and government that recognises their need to understand and respond to the ways in which 7.8 billion global customers are changing in the products and services they want and need, and the ways in which they obtain those. And the changes that are happening at the moment are global, driven by developments in society, in business, and in technology. And I hope this afternoon, through this webinar, we can explore one of those areas, which is around green energy. Now, just by way of housekeeping, we have along the bottom of your screen a Q&A section. So if you do have any questions over the course of the webinar, if you want to go through that Q&A section and just scribe your question, I'll be able to look at it through my screen, and when we get to the Q&A section, I'll be able to ask one of our panelists, and hopefully we can give you a good, sensible response to your questions. I'm going to start very briefly with David's help by just running a quick poll. And the poll is really to kind of get a sense from you in terms of how you're treating climate change in your particular business. So David, are you able to bring that poll up? So we're very basically looking for you to just say whether your business has a plan for tackling climate change. Bear with me, I'll give you a couple of more seconds and then we can just see our starting point. Okay, so I mean, that's it, very interesting in itself, because I think the discussion we're having today around green energy is very much wrapped around this challenge that we have around climate change. And I suppose where I work in the higher education sector, climate change has become one of the biggest issues for our students, for our staff and our institutions, and increasingly across the higher education sector, we're looking at how do we deliver a net zero carbon objective. I noted when I was doing some research before this webinar that we're also seeing an increasing interest in climate change from across the business sector, and that's echoed with the poll results that we've just seen. An ENGIE report in 2019 found that 75% of executives felt that sustainability was fundamental to their business and to having a competitive advantage in their business. And with that, also a separate Glassdoor survey noted that 75% of 18 to 34-year-old employees felt it really important for their businesses to be taking action around sustainability and climate change. So we, in the course of 30 years, my working life, we've seen a fundamental shift in the way that businesses are thinking about sustainability and wanting to tackle sustainability as a value. And with that, climate change is probably the most profound challenge for our age. The Paris Accord has set a global challenge to keep our temperatures within 1.5 degrees of the current climate, and that, I suppose, raises some profound challenges for our lifestyles, but also for our businesses. And we're going to hear about kind of the role that green energy plays within that, and it's very much an important contributor to the way that we will address climate change. Our speakers today are from across UK's business around green energy. And we're going to hear a little bit about how UK is performing against other countries with regards to the delivery of green energy. what form of power generation is most successful, and also what consumers need to consider when they are selecting green energy. And very quickly, let me introduce the panelists. So we have Tom Hoynes, who's the Managing Director from Co-op Community Energy. We have Greg Swenson, who is the CEO for Brigg Macadam. And we also have Tom Packingham, who is the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at OVO Energy. And I'm going to introduce them briefly. Just before we kind of come on to our three panelists, I suppose the one other thing, I want to kind of give you my own personal reflections on the challenge around climate change and green energy. UCL, University College London, where I work, we have set ourselves a net zero carbon target for 2030. It's probably the most ambitious target across the HE sector. And when we look at our carbon footprint is made up of three primary elements. Around about 20% of our carbon footprint is related to the energy we use. So that's the heat and the electricity we use within our buildings and in our campus. About 10% of our carbon footprint is related to travel, and the remainder is related to the products and services we buy. So 70% of our carbon footprint is what we class as almost indirect carbon from the products and services we buy. So we need to do a lot of work with our supply chain to get them to shift the way they think about carbon, and also to tackle themselves so that we can get the benefit of that. And I think that kind of comes to the crux of a question here, which is when you look at carbon within your businesses, it's not just about how you operate as a business, it's about the products you're selling and your marketplace, because more and more of the people who are going to be buying your products are interested in how you are delivering those products in a zero carbon way. And green energy has a fundamental role to play within that. Okay, let's start with our speakers. And I'm going to introduce Tom Hoynes first to say a little bit about himself and a bit about Co-op Community Energy. Tom.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Richard. So my name's Tom Hoynes. I am Managing Director of a company called Co-op Community Energy. We are a joint venture between Octopus Energy, who are a business and domestic supplier, energy supplier, and the Mid-Counties Cooperative, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, retail cooperative in the UK, independent retail cooperatives in the UK. I've been in the energy industry now for about 10 years, and for 9 of those years with a particular focus on renewable energy. I guess most of my time has been spent looking at setting up contracts with renewable generators, which are called power purchase agreements, PPAs, and agreeing contracts with those generators to purchase their electricity over sort of 6 months to 5 years, something like that. I've also spent a few years developing commercial on-site renewable or low carbon projects as well, whether it's complete LED retrofit to industrial units or solar panels or battery storage, even done a bit of biomass and heating in my time. But the current role is largely focused or entirely focused on developing a niche area of the renewable energy market, which is this concept of community energy, which is sort of member-owned, community-owned renewable generation assets, which people can invest in, and the surplus profits from which will go to benefiting the communities in which they operate. So that's me. That's fairly high level. I hope that's enough information for now.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Let's move along to Greg Swenson, who's the CEO for Brigg Macadam. Greg.
Hi, nice to be here, and thanks for the introduction. Again, my name's Greg Swenson. My firm is called Brigg Macadam Limited, and we are traditional investment bankers. So we raise money for projects, companies, occasionally sovereigns, and financial institutions, mostly in emerging markets, mostly in Africa, although we've moved around to different markets in the last year or two. But again, we're traditional investment bankers in the sense that we raise money from lenders and investors for critical infrastructure, and most of the stuff, much of the work we do happens to be in renewable energy because it's become such an important asset class.
Great, thanks, Greg. I think the final introduction is to Tom Packingham, who is the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at OVO Energy. Tom.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me along. Just a quick, Richard, just in case you didn't realize, when you move your papers around on your desk, it makes a really loud noise on the microphone. So I want to be a tiny bit more. Maybe it's just my ears. I'm very sensitive. But just to let you know. Hi, everyone. I'm from OVO Energy. OVO Energy is an energy retailer. The OVO Group is an energy decarbonization business and a technology business. Is how we think of ourselves, and have recently launched our 10-year plan to 2030, which is entitled Plan Zero, and it sets out our vision for our own operations and the services that we deliver to our customers. So scopes 1, 2, and 3 emission reductions to net zero. So that will obviously involve a significant absolute reduction in emissions and also an offset component or a carbon abatement component as well, which is an important subject that maybe we could touch on today. OVO itself is a challenger energy business, or what I guess was considered to be until it acquired one of the big six, SSE, a couple of years ago. We are the third largest energy retailer in the UK, but we also operate in France, Spain, and Australia, where we run retail operations. And we have a technology business called Kaluza, which provides technology to energy retailers, but also the flexibility backbone that the energy system of the future will need in order to support the growth of renewable energy generation. And again, we could go into a little bit more detail on that as we go through it. My background is in this space. I've been working in this sector since 2005, when I launched a low emission taxi company. I've also run low energy retrofit of buildings business, which I worked with your team at UCL, actually, Richard, quite often, quite a leading team on energy behavior in buildings and building physics. And I think we have an amazing opportunity over the next 20 years, a big challenge, but there's been a lot of progress over the last 5 to 10 years in the power sector in particular. Now we have some real challenges in the heat and transportation sector, and it's those are the big ones that we need to tackle next.
Great, thanks, Tom. And maybe you can stay with me, because I want to start some of the questions with you and really look at kind of, I suppose, the political picture, if I'm honest. So obviously the UK became the first major country to legislate for a net zero target for carbon emissions by 2050. And I wonder what your thoughts were on the policy and regulations that need to be put in place to create a market environment that increases consumer and business demand for low carbon solutions and encourages sustainable investment in this sector.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be fine. I mean, the UK government the UK as a country, and the UK government has recently built on this, has been doing excellent work in this space over the last 10 years, particularly, as I mentioned, in the electrical generation power sector. The government announced at the end of last year a whole range of really ambitious and interesting plans. The Energy White Paper was released, the 10-point plan, and we're seeing this year a whole swathe of new policy consultations, policy direct documents, which are starting to sort of attempt to deliver the targets that were set out in that plan. So, for example, part of the 10-point plan was to be installing 600,000 heat pumps in UK homes a year by 2028. The current number of new heat pumps a year is in the region of 20 to 25,000. So there is a massive growth required. And what we now need, so we have great targets, we have great ambition. What we now need is the detail, the policy details that allow us to get there. I suspect that we will see our government, and we should expect to see our government follow a similar sort of approach as it took to driving the decarbonisation of the power sector that we've seen to date. Essentially a form of pump priming support subsidy that allows those technologies which are not yet ready cannot yet support merchant risk, come to market more quickly. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. Obviously, there's also a large infrastructure investment program that's required in the energy space at the moment. We're seeing an ongoing debate as we enter into the next pricing framework for the networks as to what is an acceptable rate of return for the network operators, which obviously form an important part of the infrastructure of the future. And the government and the regulators more specifically needs to make sure it gets that right, which is a fine balance between driving the investment needed whilst not overly imposing costs on consumers, because obviously ultimately all of this needs to be paid for by the consumer and or the taxpayer. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions about policy costs, where they should sit on the energy bill, whether they should be picked up by general taxation. I'm sure other speakers on the panel will have some things to say. I'd just like to end with one observation, which is, of course, there is a kind of a missing piece of the jigsaw, which is growing in prominence and has obviously been picked up increasingly over the years, increasingly particularly, which is a carbon price. And the introduction of a carbon price would actually simplify things considerably, whilst also make things more complex at the same time. Somehow we have to price carbon into our system. And when we come on to what that might look like, and specifically what that might look like in the energy retail space, there's a lot of further sort of areas for innovation and complexity which we need to address, but also opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about carbon price is really interesting at the moment, and I think when you look at the challenge we have around heat, will a carbon price help to drive people away from the reliance on natural gas, let's say, for the provision of heat to alternatives? I suppose associated with that, do we have suitable levels of heat alternatives at the moment?
I mean, I imagine other people want to speak at this point, but yes, it's an important point. Yes, we should totally talk about heat and the dynamics in heat. It's a very hot topic. There is uncertainty there, but we do know more and more, and we do need to be careful on heat, that we're not kicking the can down the road. The fact is that we can electrify our heating stock. It's not easy, but we can, our housing stock for heating. It's not easy, but it can be done. It's proven that it can be done. And there are savings to be made by economies of scale. And we need to move fast on that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the government faces is how to address that from a policy point of view, with all the political potential pitfalls that they face.
Great, thanks, Tom. I want to bring in the other two panelists on this particular question about the role of government and what government can do to incentivize the market. And perhaps I'll start with you, Greg, as an investor, and get your perspective.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think that the investors that we talk to are, one of the first questions they ask is, what's the role of the government in the particular country that we're active in? And one of the challenges is getting governments, especially in Africa and other emerging markets, to complete concession agreements, PPAs, et cetera. And I'm glad both panelists brought up these important points so far. So that's one of the first questions. Now, the UK, is obviously on the front end of the curve and really a leader in the transition away from carbon. But a lot of countries, are way behind. A lot of countries don't even have the the traditional infrastructure or energy infrastructure in place. And that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And you think about countries in Africa and Southeast Asia where we work, a lot of the grids aren't really efficient. You don't have that last mile or that connective infrastructure that brings the energy from the power plants, whether they're carbon or renewable. They don't even have that infrastructure in place. So these are important issues for governments, and I think what I would emphasize on specifically for emerging markets or developing markets is the governments really have to take a leading role in executing PPAs and offtake agreements, because it's even more important in the developing world where they don't really have the balance sheet or the capital themselves. The governments don't have that, so they really dislike CapEx, capital expenditures, because they just don't have that kind of money like we do in the West. But on the other hand, if they can execute the operating, the OpEx, execute those PPAs and those offtake agreements, that's what facilitates the capital investment. So yeah, government policy is really important. And I think I just would add one thing in terms of, not getting away from developing markets and back to developed markets like the UK, like the US. I think another good point that I think Tom brought up was, there is a point where this becomes a regressive tax. If you over-regulate and you're too aggressive on targets and on regulation, it really does end up on the back of working people and even small business. And so we have to be cautious and be aware of that the policies dictated from Washington and Westminster aren't necessarily on the backs of the people that are working, that depend on carbon or traditional energy, and just make it so that it's a transition, but not too much of a burden or any burden at all that ends up again on working people, small business, and as I think Tom pointed out, on taxpayers. And I think we've seen some of that already, and in the pushback that you might get in some countries. And then also just the two other issues in terms of the government's role. One is to keep in mind that it is a transition. I think if you look at the exploration and development of natural gas has really been it's a great benefit to carbon reduction, especially in the US, but really all over the West. And it's really viewed now, not necessarily as, it's still in that carbon column, but I think you'll see even from the most aware investors, I'll use BlackRock for an example, that really puts a premium on ESG and green everything. And you see that they do understand that there's still a need for infrastructure around natural gas as a transition to renewables. And look what happened in Texas a few weeks ago when the the wind and solar producers just weren't up to the task of 24/7 power generation. So I think that's another thing that governments have to keep in mind.
Great, thanks, Greg. And actually, you raised a couple of points which we'll hopefully come to a little bit later in the session. Tom, just finish with your own perspective on the role of government. Hoynes.
Yeah, really. I mean, not a huge amount to add that's new. I think picking up on the carbon price question, which Tom was talking about, and the electrification of heating as well, and the strains that could potentially put on the grid, and the increase in demand for new generation that electrification will bring about. We're in an interesting time at the moment where actually sort of what you call the levelized cost of energy, the cost to deploy new build generation projects is actually feasible on current market value. So you don't find, whereas 5-10 years ago, the big call to government was, well, we need subsidies, we need long-term security, we need, we need to know what's going to be there in 15-20 years. And it would be interesting to see, I think, if a carbon price does come about, whether that could add anything to strengthening long-term security. I'm sure it's something that Greg looks into on a daily basis, is, when he's speaking to investors and things, is, yes, it works over, new build renewables works as it stands with market prices, but what can be done about long-term security and being able to, go to the bank and borrow money based on your generation projects. I think that's one of the key things that needs to be addressed.
Great, thanks, Tom. I mean, I'm keen to just for a couple more minutes just to stay on this topic of the role of government, and I suppose my point here is going to be about the COP. So we have the 26th Climate Change Conference of the Parties coming to the UK this year in Glasgow in November. It should have taken place last year. So the UK is hosting this. Given kind of some of the points you've already raised, but also in the context that the UK, in terms of global emissions, is probably emitting something like 1% of global emissions, where the US and China combined emit about 43% of global emissions. What do you think we can expect out of the COP later this year? What do you think the government, the UK government, should be bringing to the party as such? And let me start that with Tom Packingham.
Thanks. Yeah. just before we do, I think back to the previous question, and I'd just like to kind of add some, you know, I don't know what, some softening of Greg's point about Texas. I think it's important to make sure that watching this seminar comes away with the idea that the responsibility for the problems in Texas should be borne by renewables. I'm sure that's not what Greg meant. I'm quite certain what he meant was, in a grid of the future, you do need to have resilience, and renewables, you know, alone may struggle to provide that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree with your comment. Absolutely.
Because I think that's a very important point from a governmental point of view. And there's a, you know, the question of politicization of the move to a zero carbon system is a serious risk to its progress. And the, you know, the information that flowed from Texas immediately after those problems was very telling as to the true state of the willingness of certain players in the global ecosystem to exploit information to their own advantage in a way that has been done for 20 years. And I think the thing from a policy point of view that one should, you know, for 20 years, 50 years actually, a lot longer, but one of the things that should be, I think most people would say is, let's have a level playing field for these technologies as a minimum policy position from government. So let's make sure that the true cost of all the different energy technologies that are on the table are accounted for and are picked up and are paid for. And I think in a way that's why a carbon price is so elegant. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is very elegant in that regard. And I think that's why as a policy lever it's very important, which leads nicely onto the COP question. I think you've actually asked two questions there, Richard. One of them is about is the UK relevant, kind of thing. Is 1% of global emissions relevant? And the second is, what can the UK do as a leader and as a host of COP? To the first point, I think, you know, we really must see this challenge as a global challenge, and frankly as a global opportunity. We certainly see lots of things as a global opportunity. Let's see this as one. But that we should not think about this within our own national borders. And there are a lot of interesting reasons why that can be helpful. And there's a great article, by the way, if anyone's interested, in Prospect about 3 or 4 months ago about nationalizing the debate in terms of driving behavior effectively to good. But we must bear in mind that you know, there's a per capita point going on here. And that leads on to another point. And it sometimes comes across as a bit wishy-washy, and sometimes in hard-nosed business terms doesn't really count for anything. But actually, I think it's important that I say it, which is that there is a question of morality in the society that we are building together, and business has a place in that conversation and has a responsibility to act as a moral citizen. And you know, this as a global problem, if you are going to look at it that way, you need to look at historical emissions responsibility, which is very clearly heavily weighted in favor, in quotes, or the responsibility of developed countries. And secondly, the per capita point. So again, maybe others have a view. I just don't think we can pass over this conversation without raising the subject of moral responsibility. Secondly, as for what the UK can do, I mean, I think we can play up the net zero commitment. We can share our expertise as to how we've managed to get to where we've got to. I mean, the move away from coal is really significant and is a great success. And the financing structures that have supported that as well are a great success. And the government, our government, has identified where we're strong. And the third area where we are strong and can show leadership is in really finding creative and interesting ways in financing the technology that's required. And there's a lot of interesting work going on there. So those are some areas. There is also a technological element which we can bring to the world. But
great, thanks, Tom. I mean, maybe I'll sort of pass the same question to actually, let's start with Tom Hoynes around the role of the UK government in the COP later this year.
Yeah, I think the morality question, the morality point, again, just to call on what Tom was talking about, is a very good one. You know, it's particularly in the sort of niche carved out area of the market that I'm looking at, which is this concept of community energy and who benefits from the deployment of renewable technologies, you know, and how they can be used to not just for their design purpose of reducing carbon emissions and using energy sustainably, but also benefiting the communities or the geographic communities or communities of interest in which they operate. And I think that's something which, you know, if you look at it globally, there are certainly some countries which I think we could learn a bit more from, and I know there's plans to be quite a big presence of community energy at the COP, and I think, you know, if we can share ideas and different ways of ownership models, who benefits from mass deployment of these technologies, I think that's probably the main focus for me.
Great, thanks, Tom. I mean, I'm going to come to Greg last, and partly because you know, Greg, obviously you've got an interest, obviously globally, around probably what happens at COP and what that means across nations across the world. And I wonder whether you have expectations from COP this year, and also, you know, what you would expect, or what role you expect the UK government to play.
Well, I think, you know, you have to tip your hat to the UK government for taking this leadership role, and I think that the idea that they're only, you know, a very small portion or part of the emissions globally, I think that's all the better that they're taking this leadership role, because they, you know, they're leading by example, but also it's become a real go-to point for this emerging, I'll call it an industry, but also it's a really great place to start in terms of investment, and this has become an asset class on its own. You know, renewable energy or green energy, and whether it's part of energy infrastructure or you know, as a subset or sub sector, or just, you know, there's an emerging, or actually a very well developed asset class, which is, you know, green bond funds, green energy funds, private equity funds, you name it. So, and the UK has really been on the forefront of that, going back to 2008 when the government launched the SIFs. I think it's the SIF. So I'm dating myself, but look. So I think that the fact that the conference is coming here to the UK is a really a great, you know, testament to the leadership role that they've taken. And I think when investors, when developers are looking to build renewable energy infrastructure or anything like that around the world, this is the first stop. You know, and I think the U.S., contrary to, you know, some of the heated rhetoric we hear all the time in the U.S. is really behind this effort as well. A lot of private equity money coming out of the U.S., private capital, as well as the DFIs. The U.S., like for example, the USDFC, the Development Financial Corp, you know, massive investor in renewable energy, and really they put it on the top of their list for the last 3 or 4 years, coming from Washington. So I'm pretty optimistic about both the UK and the US taking a leadership role and helping developing countries get the infrastructure in place. It requires a lot. I mean, I think it's 100 billion a year in Africa alone of infrastructure investment that's necessary, and a good portion of that will be in renewable energy.
Brilliant. I want to just move the conversation perhaps away from the international agenda to more of talking about renewable energy itself, and certainly within the UK. What we've seen over the past 30 years is a significant shift in the mix of fuels that we're using for electricity generation, with that shift away from coal to the growth, the dramatic growth in renewable energy sources. And part of that, I think, has been prompted by, I think, as Tom has already referred to, the government role in stimulating the market. I mean, I firstly, just as by way of introduction, from both Tom Hoynes and Tom Packingham, want to just hear a little bit more about their own company's development and move into renewable and green energy. So let's start with Tom Hoynes. Yeah,
so when we talk about my company, what I might do is talk about my parent companies. So it's probably a better thing to approach. So it's a really interesting different approaches from each of them. The Mid-Counties Co-op, which is a food retail co-op at its heart, as well as the other traditional co-op businesses funeral and childcare and so on. And so the Mid-Counties has been picking up a few sustainability awards, and it's really interesting actually looking at what opportunities that, you know, I think if you're embedded in the energy industry and you live it sort of day in, day out, you think some of this stuff is old hat. And, you know, you talk about sort of solar panels and LEDs being boring because, you know, they've been around for 10, 15 years. But the opportunities that the retail side of the business for the Mid-Counties has, you know, with whether it's solar panels on stores, whether it's LED lighting, even looking at sort of flexibility services, turning off the wine fridge at night because wine doesn't need to be kept cold overnight, you know, those sorts of things that can have a big impact on the overall footprint of the business is really interesting. From Octopus's point of view, I think they're looking much more at the when you look at sort of the big flagship products that tend to get a lot of coverage, they're very much interested in consumer behavior and using technology to shift that behavior. So, you know, the way the UK energy consumption profile works is the energy duck, where you have, you know, everyone gets up in the morning, it peaks, and then the total consumption drops off, and then it peaks again at sort of 5, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night. And a lot can be done in trying to smooth out that pattern. And what Octopus are looking at is different products which can help shift usage to different times of the day. So they have their agile tariff, where you get your energy prices the day before, which will show, you know, tomorrow at such and such time, you'll get charged this much per kilowatt hour to use your energy. But if you use it at a different time, it will cost you half. And that's trying to shift people's behavior. And also with their Go tariff, which is a tariff for electric vehicles in particular. You know, if you charge your car, if you're lucky enough to have an electric vehicle between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning, then you get charged 5 pence a kilowatt hour instead of your normal 14, 15 pence, whatever their standard tariff is. So it's sort of, both parent companies are approaching things in a very different way. One's sort of shifting human behavior, and one is trying to shift, you know, physical asset behavior. So it's consuming energy at the right times and more sustainably.
Great, thanks, Tom. That's really interesting around the trying to smooth the curve, which I think is something we're really interested in at UCL. Tom Packingham, interested in OVO Energy's kind of journey into sort of the green energy space.
Yeah, so OVO's mission statement is to power human progress with clean, affordable energy for all. It's the absolute heart of the point of OVO's existence, and has been there since it was founded in 2009. Now, as the company has developed and as the grid has evolved, what that means has evolved in turn. And so currently, at the end of last year, we moved from sort of a green renewable energy as a premium to a 100% renewable for all of our customers. And that's what we see the future to be. Now, that's partly possible because of what's happened to the grid over the last 10 years. And the fact that the base load of the grid, or the base renewable component of the grid, is around 50% now per year. Or zero carbon. So that's possible. I mean, I think what we'll see is we need to get that to 100%, and the government's committed to 40 gigs of offshore wind, and that will get us most of the way there. There are other requirements. Exactly the kind of how that happens, and how quickly we see the end of gas on the grid, and what format that takes, and how we deal with intermittency and storage, and, you know, long-term lulls and all that kind of thing, it remains to be seen. But so that's one component, that's the generation side. But actually, OVO takes let's look at a higher level view that we take of the energy system, which is that for the first 130 years, what we did was that we burnt coal in a power station, and when people turned on their lights or ran appliances, we burnt a bit more coal. We turned those power stations up. We responded to demand by flexing supply. Now, in the future, when we have a decarbonized grid and everything is renewable, we can no longer control supply. Supply is just what the wind does for us, or what the weather's like. So we have to turn the grid 100% on its head. And instead of flexing supply around demand, we have to flex demand around supply. Now, I don't think many people realize quite how revolutionary this is. This is literally a 180-degree turn on how we run our energy system. Now, that is an incredibly exciting challenge and is kind of the only way you can do it, but it does need to be done. And so that's the starting point, the way we look at it. So the next thing you do is you say, okay, fine. So first thing you do is build renewables, great. Then you need to work out how the hell are you going to have a fully demand responsive system with enough storage built in to deal with lulls in renewable generation. So OVO does the retail bit, the customer relationship bit, but we also develop technology that allows that demand responsive world to become a reality. What Tom described as Octopus's approach is to offer a price signal to individual customers and indeed to the appliances they own, which can integrate into those price signals and sort of change half hour by half hour. But the customer still always ultimately bears the risk of the price going up or down. In Agile, there's a cap, so that's very helpful. But you know what future versions of other companies' Agile tariffs will look like is really interesting. At the moment, energy companies actually carry the trading risk on behalf of their customers. That is that's like a key activity that energy suppliers do. They take energy wholesale risks for their customers, so that even if the customer they use a bunch more energy, but they know that the price is basically capped. And the reason they can do that is because of the profile and the trading strategies and all that kind of thing. So that's a very complex problem to solve in the future when you've got demand fluctuating all the time. And that's what OVO is working on, is how do we build technology that allows us to carry on taking that risk for the customer, so they don't have to worry about their energy prices being, you know, out of this world. And in fact, you saw in Texas recently some heartbreaking examples of people who were on flexible tariffs who were, you know, bankrupted by them. Now, again, to call out Octopus, who I think have fantastic values, they did a wonderful thing where they basically implemented a cap after the event, as I think did a couple of other energy suppliers, and that was a really excellent thing to do and absolutely appropriate. But of course, this nonetheless remains a long-term challenge we have to face, and how we get electric vehicles, heating, all this kind of thing to be demand responsive and still to provide mobility and heat services to customers is a really exciting and big challenge for the energy sector.
Yeah, I mean, it opens up a couple of questions in my mind, if I'm honest, Tom. And maybe a question to all of you is just picking up this whole question about flexing demand. I mean, there's a degree to which you can look at sort of the demand response type approach where you do try and sort of smooth the curve. I mean, the other thing I wonder about is about technology, and particularly battery technology. You know, how close are we to having a way in which we can store some of the renewable energy that we're generating through battery technology or other storage technologies? And I'm not sure who to pick on first, to be honest here, but I might start with Greg as the investor.
No, it's a great question, and it's a really great topic, and it's very topical for us because we spend a lot of time raising capital for investment in infrastructure. But what we're finding is there's a real demand or interest in battery storage, whether it's in batteries or even alternatives to batteries like flywheels that are, you know, recyclable and in many ways more efficient. But it's a big topic, and I think that if we could connect the dots on that, that's really significant. And a lot of that is driven by the EV industry, by the electric vehicles, but also by wind and solar, where it's been a big challenge. And if we can solve for that, you know, that's fantastic, because that's, you know, one of the issues or one of the challenges. I think we also have to keep in mind, and everyone should always, consider that it's not just progress in terms of discovering or making the batteries more efficient. It's also about the inputs, and that's where I think we focus a lot of our energy on. We have some companies, some clients. One of them is called TechMet, which is short for Technology Metals, which invest in the critical inputs, lithium, rare earth minerals, those kind of things that are required for EVs and wind and solar. And this is, you know, that is what's really driving a lot of a lot of the investment and excitement, because there's such a massive mismatch between supply and demand for those critical elements. And also 90 to 95% of them come from China. And I think that's to a certain degree, not only a security risk for some of the Western governments, but it's a massive risk for the big buyers. You know, when Tesla depends on China for 95% of their inputs, that's usually, you know, that should raise some alarms. So we're seeing some exciting opportunities there. And I really highlight the word opportunity, because that's what's driving a lot of this. It's you know, sustainable energy isn't sustainable if it's not profitable, if it's not economically sustainable. And I think the battery, solving this battery challenge, I think will be really critical for all the parties that are involved.
Great, thanks, Greg. Tom Packingham, coming back to yourself around the question of battery technology and how much that forms a part of your own business, I suppose, your own business approach to the provision of sort of green energy.
I was on a panel this morning about a vehicle to grid program, which is bi-directional charging, where you use electric vehicles as home energy storage devices, and was asked a question about home energy storage, batteries in the home and batteries in general. And there is a view that I ascribe to, which is not to say that you won't have lots of different technologies all working together, but there is a clear view that if every vehicle becomes electric but within a certain amount of time, which by the way is quite likely, and in the UK is now certain, within, you know, fractions of exceptions, then you will have an awful lot of batteries in the country. I mean, we're talking at the moment about 32 million vehicles in the UK, 29 or so of those are owned by householders. 95% of the time they are parked either mostly at home, but often at work. They are huge batteries. Even the smallest electric vehicle battery these days is 3 times as big as a Tesla Powerwall, which is pretty much the largest home battery. So we are just going to have a massive gigawatt hour and gigawatt hours, terawatt hours of storage and gigawatts of power at our disposal. So all we need to do is tap into that. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that battery prices have come down 80 to 90% in the last 10 years. I had a proof of concept investment in a business. We were doing some developing a battery technology. It didn't go anywhere. The modeling was based on batteries costing lithium ion being at $350 a kilowatt hour. It's now sub 100. And that was, you know, 8 years ago. So our business model is blown completely out of the water. That we've seen in solar, we've seen in lots of technologies, the cost curve, it come right down the cost curve. So in other words, batteries are super cheap. So I'm pretty, they're just gonna exist. And when people buy a car for mobility, and they get the kind of bonus of using it for energy services, it's going to be very commonplace. In fact, every vehicle will just automatically be used in this way. And the speed of change technologically in the car manufacturers, in the work we do in our intelligent energy control platforms, in the partners that Octopus has and playing off the agile tariff, it's so fast. It's coming along really, really fast. So I'm very confident about that capacity existing in the UK and elsewhere.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that we've got a few questions in the Q&A section. And John Andrews, I'm going to leave your question to last because I think it's probably the most interesting question for all the panelists to end with. That's a bit of pre-warning to each of the panelists to have a look at that question. Let me start with the question about green energy and nuclear. And perhaps, you know, this is a question for the two Toms here, but can green energy supplant the need for vast new nuclear power stations, for which we know there is investment in as well at the moment? Let's come to you, Tom Hoynes.
Can it surpass the need for nuclear? Supplant the needs. Okay. Look, I think it comes back to the biggest challenge in the UK energy market, I think, is this idea around consumer behaviour, and what can the energy market do, whether it's suppliers or government or, you know, however it's legislated for, is understanding that consumer behaviours are going to have to change in order to facilitate, new build renewables, and whether that's using flex services or whatever is going on. I think the replacing new nuclear. I mean, I've always been sort of fairly agnostic about nuclear. I don't think, I think that the challenges with it is low carbon, but it's looking like it's becoming increasingly expensive. I don't know where we've got to with the strike price now for Hinkley, but as I understood it, it is going up from the point that the strike price was agreed, not at the point that it's built. So that price every year that it's delayed is just getting higher and higher and higher. And when you look at the level, I spoke earlier about the levelized cost of electricity, and you compare new nuclear compared to new onshore wind, or even battery storage or offshore wind, solar, I think it becomes a more difficult question to answer for developing nuclear power when you just look at the out and out cost of every megawatt hour, gigawatt hour that's produced from it. I also think this concept of moving towards a more decentralized, flexible, slightly more intelligent energy system. The days of the big coal-fired power plants, being ramped up and down slightly, as Tom was talking about earlier. These big out of town generation stations going into small communities. If we want to get to this smarter, flexible energy system, by going nuclear, we are just looking at that. It's just that big out of town generator going in, and I think there's probably better ways to answer those demand questions.
Great, thanks, Tom. I've been sort of trying to work out what actually might be some useful questions for our audience, and I do want to ask one or two more of their questions. But I suppose I'd like to maybe for all three of you just get a sense of how the customers, as in businesses or residential customers, might approach this question of green and renewable energy. And I suppose there's two or three things I'd like to get your views on. The first thing is the cost. There's still a view that the cost of renewable energy is higher than the cost of electricity when it's a sort of a mixed fuel-based electricity tariff. So I'd like your views on that. Second thing is around kind of how do customers work their way around the multitude of tariffs and offers to them on green energy, and what do they need to think about if they are interested in purchasing green energy? And then the third thing is maybe sort of like a bit of a spike question around sort of batteries. If you're then starting to think about how you future-proof your business, given kind of what you've said, particularly Tom, around flexing demand around supply, are there one or two things that businesses should be thinking about now in preparedness for the changing state of our energy generation provision? And let's start that with you, Tom Packingham.
Those are three questions. There's about 6 minutes left, and I'm not quite sure. I could talk really quickly or something. Okay, so to your last question, if you're interested, you can look into it, but don't worry about it if you're not. The technology and the services are going to accelerate and come along faster and faster. Eventually, there'll be the right thing for you at the right time. So I wouldn't worry about being prepared or missing something. So fine. Secondly, how to work around tariffs. I mean, that is a really long question. It's actually a very complicated answer. There probably isn't even an answer to it. It does take a bit of work. So I'm kind of, either I didn't understand it or it's going to take too long to answer what I think I understood as a question. And as for the cost of green electricity, I think that, it's going to have to be paid for. Most of the renewable power that's being generated has been paid for through subsidies to date. We've now got this interesting system where offering 100% green energy is actually being challenged as an idea because of the low cost of renewable energy guarantee of origin certificates and the low cost of actually what do PPAs really do to the price of energy. There's a lot of debate going on there, and that's going to play out. But at the moment, basically what pays for renewable on our system is ROCs, CFDs, and FITs. So really not much else. Those are the things. So how are we going to pay for the next 50% is a big question. It's almost certainly, if it's not supported by government, going to drive up the cost of the premium for renewables. People are going to have to choose whether or not they pay for it. But what that will do is, like the first wave, it will drive out the carbon from the grid as we install more renewables. But I think, watch this space. The next couple of years are going to be really interesting as to how that happens and what level of support comes in from the government and what that means for consumers. But at the moment, it's not entirely clear.
Great, and you did that really quickly, which gives me a bit more time to come to Tom Hoynes next.
Yeah, so I'll attempt to be just as quick. So I think shopping around for an energy tariff, fine. You can. That's quite easy to do. If you're a business, you go via a broker. I think you can look at what additionality a particular green tariff might bring. That might be something that's interesting to you. For me, the big area for me, and where I think business can have a real genuine impact, rather than saying, look, we buy 100% green energy. I think the thing that's most interesting to me is, what can you do to help bring about new build generation onto the grid? And if there's a means to doing that, I think that's far better than any green tariff, to be honest. And the way that businesses might be able to do that, if they genuinely want to commit to sustainability, then you want to look at, can that commitment to sustainability and our long-term ambitions as a business help to facilitate new build generation by offering them long-term power purchase agreements, by offering them arrangements where, look, if you build this site, we will buy your energy for the next 15 years. And showing that real commitment to renewables, rather than sort of this horse trading around all of the existing generation, as Tom said, all of the existing generation that's on the grid already. Let's see if energy tariffs or engagement with generators and suppliers can bring about new build generation by offering that security. That, for me, is the best way for businesses to act on sustainability.
Great, thanks, Tom. And finally to you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, I can just echo Tom and Tom's comments and just highlight that, what's important is making sure that, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that the cost of renewables isn't on the back of small business and working people. Obviously, big corporates can handle it. BP is doing a great job, at least in marketing, but also in transitioning away from carbon. Because they can, and they always, they have a huge investment in Rosneft, and I'm pretty safe to say that Rosneft is not going to get out of the upstream oil business anytime soon. So it's okay. I think that the big corporates have that advantage. It's the small businesses that can really get hurt when energy prices if energy prices are a significant cost for them, and they go up. And I think the other thing I would highlight is just to make sure that the governments just have to, if they want to regulate or deregulate, as long as they do it to both the consumer market as well as the wholesale market. So there's no arbitrage opportunities like we saw, I think it was 20 years ago with SoCalEd and Pac Gas, where, there was this real arb moment where, the grid in Nevada was charging an arm and a leg to send energy to California because there were mismatches. So I think it's complicated, as Tom said earlier, but I think there's support for this kind of transition in at least here in Western Europe and in the U.S. There's support for it, and as time has gone, there's the difference is gradually going away. It used to be prohibitively expensive, and now the costs are coming down for wind and solar. I know we're not there yet, but I think it's good news to see the progress that we've made.
Great, thanks, Greg. Right, we're almost at the end, and I've not been able to get to the Elon Musk question, and I probably won't do. I suppose in terms of the Elon Musk statement, my view is maybe slightly more optimistic. I think when you look at the past 12 months and what we've achieved as a human society in trying to tackle a pandemic, what it shows us is that when we come together and when we utilize the resources and the brains that we have between us, we can really kind of direct ourselves, and the challenge around climate change is our next big challenge. But again, I think that we have the businesses, the innovation to find solutions to many of the questions that we're currently being posed. I want to thank our three panelists, Tom Packingham from OVO Energy, Tom Hoynes from the Co-op Community Energy, and Greg Swinson from Brig McAdam. Thank you so much for your contributions. And I want to thank you. I'm sorry you've not got round to all of your questions, but I hope you can see that this is such a major topic. We need probably more than an hour to talk about it. I still have something like 9 questions on my sheet, but thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again at a future IORMA event. Thank you.